Welcome to North Jersey Civil War Roundtable. Our speaker tonight, and I'll introduce her in just a few moments, is Dr. Jennifer Murray. Before we get started, I just want to give a few announcements out there. One is for people who came on early, you saw me introduce as many people as possible, and there are the roundtables. What we've done through our roundtable is we've offered roundtables the opportunity to speak for 15 minutes. Anything you want to talk to about your roundtable. And if you want to do that, just contact me. And if you don't have my address, I'll just say it briefly. It's easy enough. NJ Civil War RT at AOL.com. Um, again, however you work, you can slides, whatever you want. And it gives other opportunities of other roundtables. Mike Hoover, the Inland Empire, was one of our presenters, and also right now he's coming out with a schedule of other roundtables, and I know he's given us publicity. And if he's out there again, thank you. This program is also co-sponsored by the Bucks County Civil War Roundtable, the Old Baldy Roundtable, and obviously all of you know that Old Baldy was General Meade's horse. So he has a roundtable, and then the Meade Society is also a co-sponsor of this program. And if anybody feels that some program is of relevance to them and you want to be a co-sponsor, why not? And you could, we take care of the program. It's but you'll be a co-sponsor, so other people know that you're interested in it. Also, what we're doing as a public service is we are supplying our program with a link to the libraries who want to handle our program. Again, it's a public service. It's like you watch PBS and list all the names. We don't ask for any money. We don't want any money. We do the programming. We supply the library with a description of the program, and they put it on their calendar of events. As a matter of fact, what I'm going to ask what you do from now on, if anybody is speaking from the libraries I'm going to mention, you don't have to even be from that area, is please sign up with the library. The library gets credit, shows that there's an interest in the Civil War, and it also shows they get credit for all the people who attended our meeting. And last month with Dr. Murray, we had 125 people. And that's what we've been averaging when she speaks. Also, our attendance are pretty high. So the library gets credit for all the people attending our meeting. Um, and let's face it, you want to support your library. And we also give the program, so it's pre-funding. It's a program for them. And let me just give a shout out to some of the libraries who are carrying it. Is Gene Embler, our Parsippany Library. All of these libraries right now are in New Jersey, but it makes no difference. You're on Zoom and goes anywhere. Any library can take it. Of Parsippany, there's the Chester Library of Kim Warhenko, the Hackettstown Library, Jerry Galante, the Kemmerer Library of Harding Township, Margie Tichter. She's the one who out to all the other libraries. Lincoln Park, Alex McKinstry. Let me see. There's the Mendham Township Library, April Kirchdorfer, Mountain Lakes, Jennifer Lynch, Rockaway, Rachel Franklin, Roxbury, that's where Karen Soretta, Washington Township, and also the Morristown Township Library. So that's basically the notices I'm going. Oh, next month, I'll give you next month. Next month is we're having our 21st annual Civil War legal presentation. We are the only Civil War roundtable to have an annual Civil War legal program. And it's going to be uh, Lincoln's peace proposal for the conference. Again, we'll have three prominent New Jersey attorneys who happen to be members of our roundtable. However, if any attorney is out there and feels that that's the type of program he wants to participate in, we certainly glad to have you join in the program. And we do extend a welcome to that. Okay, now let me read. Oh, here we go. Let me read about Dr. Jennifer Murray. Um, she's an associate professor of history, director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War, Shepherd University, Shepherdstown, West Virginia. She's a military historian with a specialization in the American Civil War. She's a prolific author and sought-after speaker, and she's currently working on a full-length biography of General Meade, tentatively entitled Meade at War. She's the author of On a Great Battlefield, The Making, Management, and Memory of Gettysburg National Park, 1933 to 2023. She's returning to the Civil War with a reprisal of her successful 23, 24 series, each of which had over 125 people. She's done 2 lectures so far on Meade. And when I mentioned to her, I said, I don't like cutting short a lecture. So she's graciously coming back again in January for the completion of General Meade. I know you'll enjoy this program. She's the compliments. I'll tell her ahead of time. I get her compliments, and I think the worst thing anybody said was she's superb, and then they got complimentary, and I'm dead serious about that. And if I embarrass you, that's okay. You're on.
Great. Thank you so much, Rich, for that introduction. I'm going to screen share with you guys so you can see my PowerPoint. There we go. Should be on your way. Okay. Yeah, okay, should be on your screen, my PowerPoint. Hopefully you'll see a nice cover image there of George Meade and the charge of the Pennsylvania Reserves at Plum Run. Thrilled to be back with you guys. It was just a month ago that I talked with you about George Meade's career. I have to admit, as Rich said, I speak to a lot of Civil War roundtables, and I'm always happy to come back to yours, particularly because it gives me an opportunity to talk in more detail about different aspects or campaigns of Meade's career. So I've enjoyed my visits with you all, and hopefully, I mean, given the attendance, at least, it suggests that we're creating some Meade enthusiasts or Meade fans along the way. Lot of energy right now about George Meade. There's plenty of aspects of his career to explore. Last month, some of you no doubt were with me, and I talked to you about Meade up to the Battle of Gettysburg. So
okay, I'm having trouble seeing your screen for some reason. I hit you and I'm not getting the screen. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. The screen share. Oh, I got it now. And last time I said to you that I didn't think that General Meade had the mask of command, which is why I've underestimated him. So if you comment on that as we go, I would appreciate it, because I do not think that he came across as well as his skill sets are.
Right. Well, maybe we can get to that in the questions too. I'll make sure we leave enough time for questions here at the end, everybody. So what I'm aiming to do with you tonight then is talk specifically about Meade and the Battle of Gettysburg. I will get us through the pursuit. So this will take us up to July 14, 1863. And we're going to start on June 28, 1863. So we should get the battle and its entirety over the next 40, 50 minutes. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end, or your comments, and we can wade through that when we get there. So let me start similarly to how I did my talk for you all last month, giving you a contemporary comment that reflects one person's observations on Meade's leadership, and then also a comment on how a modern day historian looks at Meade's leadership at Gettysburg. The quote on the top, General Joseph Hooker writes in 1877, so this is a post-war account, specifically about Meade at Gettysburg. Joe Hooker writes that Meade was never a leader. After I left that army under him, it did nothing but blunder. Meade's been dead 5 years by the time Hooker writes that, by the way. And then a more modern assessment on Meade's leadership at Gettysburg is given to us by Alan Gelzo, who in 2013 published a book called Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. And I have no doubt that many of you on the PowerPoint or Zoom call tonight have read Gelzo's work, and you might even have observed for yourself that he is particularly critical of Meade and his interpretation. And I offer just one example here that's pretty representative of that view on Meade. And Gelzo writes that victory at Gettysburg had less to do with Meade than it did with a bevy of other minor characters. So a couple things we can think about here. Meade rises to command the Army of the Potomac, as I'll show you, on June 28th, 1863. It's a meteoric rise. He will lead the Army of the Potomac into Gettysburg, fight there for 3 days, and he will bring that army its signature victory. The Army of the Potomac's signature victory. And then as the next week or two unfold with the pursuit down to the Potomac River and the expectation that Meade should have launched a final culminating blow against Lee and the Confederates around Hagerstown or Williamsport, which he didn't, Meade's reputation will precipitously decline. So I'm writing my Meade book. Gettysburg is obviously, it figures very prominently because it brings Meade his most defining victory, but it also brings him some of his greatest and most enduring criticism. If you want anyone to pick up a good book on the Battle of Gettysburg and specifically Meade's command, take a look at Kent Masterson Brown's book. It came out a couple years ago now, but Kent writes a really good look at George Meade, specifically in the Gettysburg Campaign. So might be something worth, if you're interested in this topic, taking a look at that book as well. So let's get Meade in command. Last time I talked with you all, we ended at the Battle of Chancellorsville, or we talked about the Battle of Chancellorsville, and I said about Joseph Hooker, who is relieved of command here on June 28. But even after the Battle of Chancellorsville, there's a lot of rumors and speculation that Lincoln is going to shelve Hooker right away in mid-May. And there are rumors swirling around of who, should that happen, would replace Hooker. And one of the names mentioned pretty quickly is 5th Corps Commander George Meade. The man on the left is Henry Slocum, who commands the Union Army's 12th Corps, and the man on the right is John Sedgwick, who commands the Union Army's 6th Corps, both of whom publicly and openly say that they are willing to serve under Meade should he be elevated to Army of the Potomac command. Now, Meade doesn't think he's going to be picked to command the Army of the Potomac if, in fact, Hooker is relieved. And on May the 10th, as an example, he writes to his wife and he says, having no political influence, being no intriguer, and indeed unambitious of the distinction, it is hardly probable I shall be called on to accept or decline. So Meade doesn't think he's going to be picked should Hooker be sacked. And then the Gettysburg Campaign begins. This is a map showing us the movements of the Union and Confederate armies out of their positions around Chancellorsville, north, ultimately across the Mason-Dixon line and into Pennsylvania. Now, you all know that on June 28, 1863, in the midst of this campaign and in the midst of the Confederate invasion, Abraham Lincoln will decide to relieve Joseph Hooker, guy on the top left circle. The guy on the bottom left circle is a man named James Hardee. And Hardee is going to be tasked with giving the orders, putting Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. Hardee is in Washington, D.C., and he boards a train with the orders in hand, and he trains out to Frederick, Maryland, mostly where Meade and the 5th Corps are encamped. He gets on a horse and wagon very early in the morning on June 28th, and he sets out to find General Meade. And he finds him somewhere around 3 o'clock, 3:30 in the morning. If you all are ever in around Frederick, Maryland, you can visit this particular spot. This is called Prospect Hall. And if you look in the middle of my image there, that white grandiose structure, that is where Joe Hooker had his headquarters. It's right outside of Frederick. But if you look to the stone structure more to the right center, you'll see a monument that marks where General Meade and General Hooker met early on the morning of June 28 for this momentous change of command. The stone, particularly, it's kind of interesting, is extracted from Devil's Den, and it marks, within a couple hundred yards where this historic moment occurred. And I write in my my Gettysburg chapter about this change of command, and I just want us to think about this for a second before we move on. When Meade gets command of the Army of the Potomac, he gets command of about 93,000 men. The Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia, have invaded the North. There is real concern and fear that the Confederate Army would move on to Harrisburg, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C. They are running pell-mell out through south central Pennsylvania. They're on the banks of the Susquehanna River. In the middle of an active campaign, the President of the United States decides to switch Army commanders. And I say this, and I study American military history. I'm a Civil War specialty person, but I have a healthy amount of knowledge about American military history writ large. And I can't think of a moment that's more precarious for a change of command in American history than this moment right here. And I say that knowing that I don't mean someone who was wounded in battle like Johnston is, and then you have to replace him with Robert E. Lee. Nothing like an urgent wounding that necessitates another command. This is a deliberate decision on behalf of the Lincoln administration to switch commanders in the middle of a Confederate invasion of Union soil. This is momentous. And think of the pressure that that puts on George Meade. When he gets those orders from Hardee, his first impulse is to decline them. He actually hands them back to Hardee and he says no. And Hardee says, this is not a recommendation. It's not negotiable. This is an order. Meade accepts this, of course, and he rides off to find Hooker, as I explained, for this change of command to occur. Imperative in the new general's instructions is that he keep the Army of the Potomac between Washington, D.C. and the invading Confederate Army. Keep that in mind through the entirety of tonight's lecture. Everything that Meade does with his army has to protect Washington, D.C. from the invading Confederate Army. I research in the Army of the Potomac soldier accounts. I like to know what the men thought about George Meade. I'd like to see what they wrote about him. And I was particularly struck by some of the observations they made on June 28. Some soldiers were happy that Hooker was relieved. Some, frankly, didn't care, like this soldier, the 93rd New York. He says, once more, the Army of the Potomac has changed commanders on the eve of an important campaign, and God only knows what this change will lead to. One of the very first things that Meade does now as Army commander is try to gather intelligence. You know, he was 5th Corps commander, and now he's in command of 7 infantry corps. He needs to figure out where his army is. He needs to get better intel on where the Confederates are. How far up towards Harrisburg, for instance, or Philly have they pushed? Meade will make his headquarters in Taneytown, Maryland, right across the border. And one of the first significant orders that Meade will distribute is the Pipe Creek Circular. If you've read a bit about Gettysburg, if you've read about Meade's command, you'll instantly recognize this because it's a lightning rod for controversy. The Pipe Creek Circular, it's in the official records if you want to read it in its entirety, is essentially a contingency plan that Meade puts in place for the Army of the Potomac. Should they get into a battle with the Confederates, should they need to fall back, should they need to retreat, Meade wants them to take a position around Pipe Creek. And if you look on my PowerPoint slide, you can see Taneytown. I'll move my cursor over it. Right here, this is where Meade's headquarters is. Pipe Creek is this kind of lazy creek. There's a big Pipe Creek and a little Pipe Creek, to be exact. But Meade outlines a position for his army right here. This is Carroll County, Maryland, that he will articulate in the Pipe Creek Circular. Now, what's interesting about this as we move forward into the Battle of Gettysburg and certainly after is that people will point to the Pipe Creek Circular as evidence that Meade did not want to fight at Gettysburg. That's the bottom line to this. It's a contingency plan, but it's used by Meade detractors to say that he never had any intentions of fighting at Gettysburg. And I give you this here before I move on to my next slide. Maybe just take a moment to read the text. The time for falling back can only be developed by circumstances. Whenever such circumstances arise, it would seem to indicate the necessity for falling back, assuming this general line indicated, notice of such movement will be at once communicated to these headquarters and to all adjoining corps commanders. Contingency plan, and very few modern day U.S. Army officers would go into battle without a contingency plan. Now, someone mentioned General Reynolds. Here he is, Major General John Fulton Reynolds. He's commanding the Union Army's 1st Corps. Meade has such faith in Reynolds' ability that he will put Reynolds in command of the left wing of the Army of the Potomac. So if you think about Meade's approach, how he has his army spread out, it's like a big fan, left to right, like a big lazy arc. Reynolds is in command of the left half of the army. It's about 34,000 men. And what Meade wants Reynolds to do is to move the left half of the army north to engage or probe the expected Confederate position. He wants Reynolds to seek a meeting engagement with Lee on terms favorable to the Union Army. And he's given Reynolds 100% discretion to do this. This exchange is in the official records. Meade writes, the commanding general cannot decide whether it is in his best policy to move to attack until he learns something more definitive of the point at which the enemy is concentrating. This he hopes to do during the day. That's Reynolds' task. Now, Buford, of course, this slide, with Federal cavalry, is already out riding ahead of the Union Army, acting as the forward eyes, the ears, probing the Confederate position. Reynolds will begin moving the left wing of the Federal Army, including his 1st Corps and the Union Army's 3rd Corps and the 11th Corps, about 8 o'clock in the morning on July the 1st. July the 1st, 1863 is a Wednesday. And again, Meade has empowered Reynolds with the initiative. So if there is going to be a battle fought, it will be at Reynolds' discretion. It will be on Reynolds' decision. And that's exactly how this plays out. Now, you all know, since you've probably studied the Battle of Gettysburg in a fair amount, and you've visited that landscape, I suspect, many times, Reynolds does exactly as Meade had intended. The first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg are fired somewhere around 7, a little bit after o'clock in the morning, west of town, July 1. The exchange is initially with Union cavalry. The 1st Corps, Reynolds, and the infantry will arrive onto the field that morning. And Reynolds himself, around 10:30, will be leading 1st Corps infantry, the Iron Brigade, very famously, into McPherson Woodlot, and John Fulton Reynolds, Major General, will fall mortally wounded. This is an exchange that I'm showing on the PowerPoint. Reynolds, his personal letters are at Franklin and Marshall College. And there's an exchange between William Riddle to Reynolds' sister talking about this action on July the 1st, and specifically about Reynolds falling mortally wounded. Now, Meade will receive news of Reynolds' death around 1 o'clock. Meade is still in Taneytown, Maryland, where we have him with Army headquarters. He gets that news about 1 o'clock. And supposedly, when Meade learns that his most trusted subordinate, John Reynolds, had fallen mortally wounded, Meade exclaims that he rather would have lost 20,000 men for the country's sake than John Reynolds. So this is an important moment for Meade and Army headquarters. You know now that there is a Confederate force. You're expected that it's kind of heavy in and around Gettysburg, Adams County. You have lost your most trusted subordinate, your eyes and your ears, John Fulton Reynolds. What does Meade decide to do? Well, rather than fall back or maybe employ the Pipe Creek Circular, Meade will send his next trusted subordinate to Gettysburg, and that is Winfield Scott Hancock. Meade will summon Hancock over to Army headquarters at Taneytown. He gives Hancock all the intel and all the information he knows at that point, and then Hancock is instructed to rush forward to Gettysburg. And he tells Hancock, a little bit after 1 o'clock, if you think the ground and position there a better one to fight a battle under existing circumstances, you will so advise the general, and he will order all the troops up. So Hancock is to function pretty much like Reynolds did. Eyes and ears, look at the terrain. Is this a favorable place to offer battle? If the answer is yes, report that back to me, and I'll move the rest of the Army of the Potomac forward. So nothing about his actions here in the morning and afternoon on July the 1st are cautious. Meade is very much prepared to fight if his advisors suggest a battle in South Central Pennsylvania. And I want to just sit on that point for a moment, because Meade's getting all this intel back to him in Taneytown. And if you see where my cursor is here, this is Army headquarters right here, right across the Maryland line. So he's consuming a tremendous amount of information on July the 1st. So the point I want to make here on this particular slide is that Meade's decision, as it will play out on July the 1st, is an incredibly risky one when he moves the Union Army forward from its position in and around Maryland up to Gettysburg. And you can see that in these kind of blue arrows on the map. He has the Pipe Creek Circular in place. Union supply base is 22 miles around Westminster, and he makes a decision to move the Army forward. And I'll suggest to you all again, that's not the decisions of a cautious commander. Meade himself will arrive to the battlefield around 10 o'clock, or I'm sorry, around 1 o'clock. He leaves for the battlefield around 10. So he'll depart Army headquarters around 10 o'clock, and he arrives to Gettysburg, he says in his account, his official report, sometimes after 1 a.m. He approaches Gettysburg and finds himself on East Cemetery Hill. You can kind of imagine the terrain here, the East Cemetery Hill with the Evergreen Gatehouse. There, he will meet with Dan Sickles, 3rd Corps Commander, Gouverneur K. Warren, the Chief Engineer of the Army of the Potomac. He will meet with Oliver Otis Howard, the 11th Corps Commander, and Henry Slocum, 12th Corps Commander. And the first thing that Meade does once he gets there, again, it's a little bit after 1 o'clock, now in the morning, July the 2nd, after he has his consultation with his subordinates, is he rides what will become the Union line, the Cemetery Hill position in the Fishhook. Remember, Meade, pre-war, pre-Civil War, is a topographical engineer. So this is a person whose career, professional training is based on topography. He's never been to Gettysburg before. He's never been in Adams County. So he wants to survey as much of the terrain in the area as he can. And he'll spend several hours doing this, actually. This guy in the image is going to become important in the circle here. This is Captain William Payne. And I'll come back to him in a couple slides, but he is an aide to General Meade, and he will be responsible, one, for helping guide Meade to Gettysburg, and two, doing this real early reconnaissance with Meade of what will become the Fishhook position. And Meade doesn't get to the Leicester House, which now will operate as Army of the Potomac headquarters, until about 6 o'clock in the morning. So he spends, 4 or 5 hours surveying the terrain, even down towards Little and Big Round Top. Now, when I talked with you all last month, I'd mentioned John Keegan, and maybe even showed this exact slide. I'm sure someone here will note if I had. Keegan writes that the first and greatest imperative of command is to be present in action. And as I talked to you about the fighting on July the 2nd, and even the 3rd, but certainly the 2nd, I want to make the case, the primary evidence makes the case, that General Meade is incredibly active and present during the Battle of Gettysburg. And his influence, in no small way, will direct the Union outcome on July the 2nd and 3rd. So what's going on by this point? Let's transition to day 2. This is arguably the most contentious day for studying Meade and understanding Meade of the 3-day battle. He's ordered the Army of the Potomac forward, basically the right wing. So he's waiting on the 6th Corps to come up, the 5th Corps to come up. We're all converging now on Gettysburg. He's waiting for his army to get there. And as they arrive, Meade will, or his army will, take a position, as I mentioned, in the shape of a fishhook. This is a map that should look pretty familiar. You can see the town of Gettysburg. Look south, look at the Union position in blue. You can see the Confederate position, 70-some thousand men stretched out along Seminary Ridge in a big lazy U, about 6-mile long battle line compared to about 3 miles long for the Union Army on Cemetery Ridge. Now, on July the 2nd, interestingly enough, Meade is initially looking at the right flank of his army. And if you see right here where my cursor is, the reason Meade's concerned about the right flank in no small part is because of the proximity and the importance of the Baltimore Pike. This is a main supply line for the Union Army. And he had sent out some of his subordinates, or requested that they probe that position. Is there an opportunity to make an attack from our right flank? Is that ground favorable for an offensive? And reports come back in to the Leicester House, back to Meade, that say no. Nothing on the federal right is advantageous to an offensive. Well, we know that the situation on July the 2nd is not going to really consume the federal right. It will consume the federal left. And this, I heard you guys chatting about Sickles as we were getting ready to start, will be one of the signature, most controversial, debated, and engaging moments of Meade's leadership at Gettysburg. What happens with Dan Sickles in the Union Army's 3rd Corps? Sickles, of course, is the guy on the left. He is supposed to take the 3rd Corps and extend the federal line south. And if you all can think about Gettysburg, think about Cemetery Ridge, picture now in your mind's eye with me the Pennsylvania Monument, that big white granite monument. From the Pennsylvania Monument south towards the Round Tops is the ground that Meade wanted Sickles to hold. Now, Sickles, as we know, finds this ground undesirable. And in the morning, early afternoon of July the 2nd, there's a bunch of back and forth between Sickles and Army headquarters. The guy here on the far right, this guy, this is Meade's son, also named George. He's a captain on his dad's staff. At 9 o'clock in the morning, July the 2nd, he is dispatched down to find Dan Sickles and make sure that the 3rd Corps is in the position that Dad, Army commander, wants. And you can see some of Meade's own writing on this. He says, I had sent instructions in the morning directing Sickles to form his corps in the line of battle to the left of Hancock's corps. And this is going to start beginning at 9 o'clock, a bunch of back and forth between 3rd Corps headquarters and Army headquarters. Now, what complicates this a little bit is that there's an absence of clearly written orders from Army headquarters exactly, specifically, unambiguously articulating where Meade wants each corps to go. This map that we're looking at here is the famous Payne map. Remember a couple slides ago, I said, take a look at Captain Payne. He's going to be important. This is the guy who draws the positions as Meade wants them on that midnight, post-midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. ride on July the 1st. This is the Payne map. It's digitized online if you're interested in looking at it in detail. It's very possible and probable that Sickles got a copy of the Payne map, that he knew where Meade wanted him to go. It's also very possible and probable that Sickles got oral orders from Meade at East Cemetery Hill at the Gatehouse early on July the 2nd of where Meade wanted the 3rd Corps to go. I want to give a shout out, because I think he's on the Zoom screen here, to a friend of mine, Art, who has collected any number of wonderful Civil War artifacts, documents, papers, one of which he has shared with me some time ago that's really relevant to this issue. If you're familiar with the John Batchelder papers, first historian in the Battle of Gettysburg, it's a wonderful series of letters from all sorts of participants in the battle, and one of which Meade writes to John Batchelder in the winter of 1868, and he says exactly this. Picking the most important sentence here, in my estimation, in that letter. He says, "The greater part of my orders were made verbally through staff officers." So I tell you this because when we get into the Meade-Sickles controversy, the absence of definitive, unambiguous orders about where Meade specifically, beyond a shadow of doubt, wants the 3rd Corps to go do not exist. But if you look at all the other Union Corps commanders, there are 7 total, so 6 others, all 6 of them had their corps where Meade wanted it. So Sickles, unhappy with his position, and we can get into this in the Q&A in more detail if you want, will move about 10,000 men, give or take, forward into the Peach Orchard, Wheatfield, Devil's Den, up along the Emmitsburg Road, completely detached from the main Union line back on Cemetery Ridge. And I think some time ago, I talked to you guys about Meade and the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. That's the congressional investigation in the early months of 1864 that specifically looks at Meade's leadership at Gettysburg. And a big part of that conversation is about July the 2nd. And Sickles is going to defend his actions. Sickles is going to say he doesn't have any orders. And here, exactly the quote I'm showing you, he says, "I determined to wait no longer the absence of orders and proceeded to make my dispositions on the advance line." It will be about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when Sickles' forward movement is complete. He starts it, two or so hours earlier. It's pretty much complete, 3:30 or so. And the apex of the line, again, think of your Gettysburg topography, is in the Peach Orchard. That's where the salient is. And Meade and some of his staff officers will ride out to the Peach Orchard sometime shortly before 4 o'clock to look at this new position. And if Meade wanted Sickles to withdraw from it, it was not going to be practical because the Confederates, this is Longstreet's 1st Corps, have already started their grand offensive for July the 2nd. And artillery shells are starting to fall in and around the Peach Orchard and all along Sickles' line. So for me, looking at George Meade and his leadership on July the 2nd, Meade is everywhere. He's everywhere. And you can trace him and his presence on July the 2nd through the primary source accounts. For Sickles in the forward movement, the Third Corps, it puts Meade in a position to have to react. And it puts Meade in a position to scramble to shore up that federal line, because Sickles' line is getting hit, from end to end. Ultimately, Meade will pull troops from every federal corps except for the 11th, because they'd been so heavily hit the day before, to reinforce Dan Sickles and the Third Corps. It's remarkable. We always think about the Union Army at Gettysburg fighting a defensive battle, and they are. They're fighting a defensive battle. But on July the 2nd, Meade is actively plucking brigades, divisions from all parts of his line. He's cannibalizing it to go and reinforce Sickles. And Cemetery Ridge is deeply threatened on July the 2nd because the Confederate attack is incredibly successful. Incredibly successful. And there's a specific moment late on the afternoon of July the 2nd when, and again, think of like the Pennsylvania Monument area south, there's a gaping hole in the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, and Meade is urgently trying to get reinforcements to plug that line. There'll be some First Corps guys come in and plug the line. And there are soldiers, some of them Meade's staff officers, who write about how active Meade is being in plugging his line. I give you an example. This is Lieutenant Paul Oliver, and he says about Meade, so putting reinforcements in the federal line, today south of the Pennsylvania Monument. He writes, "I've always looked upon this act of pluck and daring on the part of General Meade as of considerable importance at the time, as it restored the courage and morale of the troops, and it helped to inspire the men with confidence." It's this point in the fight on July the 2nd that Meade and his horse, Old Baldy, heard you guys mention him at the beginning, will come under fire. A Confederate bullet will nick Meade's pant leg, I guess, and it will lodge in Baldy's ribs in his stomach. For Old Baldy, this is the Meade Equestrian Monument here in my image, the top part. That will be his 5th wound, and it will be his final wound. He survives, but he's not going to be used as Meade's trusted war horse again. And Meade writes about this on July the 8th, specifically about Old Baldy. He says he's living, Old Baldy is still living and apparently doing well. I did not think he could live, but the old fellow has such a wonderful tenacity of life that I am hopes that he will. And all this urgency, all this scurrying around, Meade is plucking all these federal brigades, divisions, reinforces the Cemetery Ridge, the Union line, and he's successful in doing so. Confederates will have some success on July the 2nd. For instance, they'll capture Devil's Den, and they will capture the Peach Orchard. The Third Corps is crushed, about 40% casualties, including Dan Sickles, but the Union line holds. So that evening, after a horrific day of fighting, Meade returns to Army headquarters around 8 o'clock. And around midnight, he will convene a council of war with his subordinate officers. And he essentially wants to know from them what they think he and the Army of the Potomac should do. He sends this message down to DC. This is off to General Henry Halleck. He says, "I shall remain in my present position tomorrow, but am not prepared to say, until better advised of the condition of the Army, whether my operations will be of an offensive character or a defensive character." So he wants advice. So take a quick look around the images there. That's who's at the Council of War. All the corps are represented. Some will actually have kind of a double representation. Sickles is out, so you see David Bell Birney here on the right. Him. John Newton will be here to represent the First Corps. Butterfield, of course, is Chief of Staff. John Gibbon is representing the Second Corps. This is Alpheus Williams, who is over to represent the 12th Corps. And they will sit, debate, discuss, share intel for a couple hours. Now, what's interesting about this Council of War is that Meade will have his Chief of Staff, Dan Butterfield, actually write questions that will guide not only the conversation, but also the vote, the decision-making process. These are in the official records. If you want to take the OR sometime, you can look at the Council of War questions. This is what they're discussing and debating. And at the end of the day, the important outcome is that, yes, the Army of the Potomac is going to stay and fight another day. And they will do so holding their defensive position on Cemetery Ridge. Third day of the battle. A little bit after 1 o'clock, the Confederate artillery in the Peach Orchard opens fire, initiating Pickett's charge. It is tremendous amount of artillery shells landing in and around Army headquarters. That's the Leicester House. Meade initially doesn't want to leave the Leicester House, Army headquarters. He wants to stay, where he's at. He's present. People know where he is. But his aides will advise him it's not safe there, so they will move over to Powers Hill. Briefly, change of headquarters, relocation. Frank Haskell here on the left is going to be the Union Army officer that will ride over to Army headquarters and tell the officer cadre there that the Confederates are advancing. So after the 2-hour artillery bombardment, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, some 13,000 Confederates, Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble's division, will make that massive frontal assault we call Pickett's charge, trying to break the Union center. Meade, temporarily at Powers Hill, will leave Powers Hill. He'll ride over to Cemetery Ridge. He comes up the east slope, so the back slope of Cemetery Ridge, somewhere around 3 o'clock, and he sees the tail end or the final remnants of the repulse, the federal repulse of Pickett's charge. And seeing that, sort of confirming that the federal line had held, Meade, in a sort of uncharacteristic display of emotion, like an impulse, will ride with one of his staff officers after the charge has been repulsed, Union line secure, will ride down the length of Cemetery Ridge. And the Army of the Potomac had just repulsed the biggest assault in the American Civil War. This is a huge moment. And I think about this, stand next time you're on Cemetery Ridge and think about Pickett's charge and the euphoria coming out of those Union soldiers, shouting Fredericksburg or thinking of all the battles that they had suffered defeats or setbacks thus far. Now they see that victory at Gettysburg is assured. And here comes Meade and his entourage down Cemetery Ridge. What a sight that must have been. There was a enthusiastic cheering, which might have been heard by the enemy on the other side of the valley. And by 4 o'clock, a little bit after, the Battle of Gettysburg is over. And by any reasonable measure, on July the 3rd, Meade had done well. He commanded the army, 3 days before the first shot of the battle was fired. 3 days of fighting, which will end up being the largest, bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. It will result in 51,000 combined casualties, and Meade's Army of the Potomac wins. And if you look at soldiers' diaries or letters on July 3rd, 4th, maybe even a little bit after, 5th or 6th, they are very favorable about Meade's leadership. Here's just one example. Very simply, Meade had done splendidly. But let me leave you with this thought. I've got just a tiny batch of slides left, because I want to make a comment about the pursuit. Meade's reputation is singularly tied to Gettysburg. I worked seasonally for the National Park Service when I was a student the whole way through my PhD program at Gettysburg. I worked there for 9 summers. I know that battlefield and that landscape better than any inch of earth in this country. And I have heard countless times people come to Gettysburg, they know a little bit about Robert E. Lee, maybe know that it's a Union victory, but they're not always real sure about Meade, like who commanded the Union Army. Was it, who is this George Meade character? You know, he's been overshadowed so much 160 years later. But there's no doubt that in July of 1863, George Meade is a household name, without question. There's a newspaper in Vermont that wants him to run for president the next year. I mean, which he would have been horrible at, by the way, but victory in Gettysburg under Meade's leadership propels him to unprecedented heights and defines his reputation. But then, after the battle, comes the pursuit, which is just shy of 2 weeks, and Meade's reputation goes from the highest of high almost to the lowest of the lows. Because people in the North, and this includes Abraham Lincoln, not only wanted Meade to defeat Lee, which he did, but then there's an expectation that you pursue the defeated enemy and you completely annihilate him. This is George Templeton Strong. He writes in his diary on July the 5th, so this is a civilian, but on July the 5th, he writes, "Suppose Meade should bag Lee and his horde of traitors as Burgoyne and Cornwallis were bagged near a century ago." That painting is exactly that. That's the Battle of Saratoga. So there's a thought or a hope or an expectation that Meade can do what Horatio Gates did at Saratoga in 1777, and that's take an entire army off of the map. Now, that's incredibly difficult, and we'll see that Meade doesn't do it, and his reputation is tied to that. The first letter that Meade writes at the end, after the battle is over, comes on July the 5th, and he says, "It was a grand battle, as is in my judgment a most decided victory, though I did not annihilate or bag the Confederate army." Now he's going to get his army moving. So the Army of the Potomac will depart from Gettysburg on July the 5th. And if you look at the blue arrows, you can see their movement over ultimately, if you see where my cursor is here, to a place south of Hagerstown. This is called the Hagerstown-Downsville line. And Robert E. Lee in the red and the Army of Northern Virginia will find themselves with their backs to the Potomac River, and Meade is going to have an opportunity to attack, which he doesn't, as we'll see. Meade, early on in the pursuit, is very well received. He will pass through Frederick, Maryland. This is his son writing. He says that the ladies of Frederick will shower flowers on Meade. They'll give him bouquets. He says, "Papa will end the war. The man named Meade is quite well, and notwithstanding his hard work, looks well." When Meade gets to Frederick, he writes another letter to his wife. This is one of my favorites. This is July the 8th. Meade writes, "From the time I took command until today, now over 10 days, I've not changed my clothes, have not had a regular night's rest, and many nights not a wink of sleep, and for several days did not even wash my face and hands, no regular food, and all the time in a great state of mental anxiety. Indeed, I think I have lived as much in this time as in the last 30 years. I use that letter a lot because I want us to think about the mental, physical, emotional, intellectual stressors on George Meade in the days after the Battle of Gettysburg. He writes on the 8th that he hadn't changed clothes since the time he took command. Well, that was June 28th, right? He's in a mental, physical, intellectual state that, as a Civil War historian, I can only write about this. I can never even come close to mirroring or capturing the essence of what he's experiencing. So let me talk about the 12th, and then I'll see what questions you guys have. One thing I want us to keep in mind, y'all, and this is super important. Look at the circular faces in the top line there. This is the Army of the Potomac and how it changes during the Gettysburg Campaign. The first top line of faces, Corps commanders, is the Army as it was when Meade took command on June 28th. Look at it on July the 7th. First Corps has a new Army commander, or Corps commander rather, it's John Newton. Reynolds is dead, as we saw. Hancock is wounded at Gettysburg. He's replaced by William Hayes, not Alexander. And then Sickles is wounded, temporarily replaced by David Bell Birney, but then replaced by William Blinky French. So 1, 2, and 3 Corps commanders different. 5, 6, 11, and 12 are the same. But Meade, importantly, has lost his most 2 trusted subordinates. That's John Reynolds and General Winfield Scott Hancock. So when we get to a position down along the banks of the Potomac River that Meade is taking advice or soliciting input from his subordinates on whether or not the Army of the Potomac, should attack an entrenched Confederate position, he's taking counsel from the likes of William French. Right? He doesn't have the Reynolds or the Hancock to go to. And this is ultimately the third and final council of war, the Gettysburg Campaign. He has one the 2nd, we talked about. There's one on the 4th, we did not talk about, and this one here on the 12th. And you can visit that particular site here along the banks of the Antietam Creek. Meade puts the issue to a vote. And as he says, that his subordinates did not think that the attack would succeed, or it was really worth the risk in some ways. So they decide to send out reconnaissance, sort of probe the Confederate position. That will happen on July the 14th. And in that intervening time, the Potomac River had lowered, and that would give Robert E. Lee a chance to get the remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia back across the Potomac and back into Virginia. Meade is under constant scrutiny about the pursuit and not doing enough. He's hearing a lot of criticism and prodding from Washington, D.C., and he is, by July the 14th, fed up with it. And that afternoon, this is captured in the official records, Meade offers to resign. Of course, it's not accepted. Same day, Abraham Lincoln writes this famous unsent letter. I actually just taught this very letter today. I'm teaching Civil War this semester, and we're in the Gettysburg Campaign, and I gave this letter to my students this morning and asked them to read a little bit about Lincoln and Lincoln's expectations of Gettysburg and how Lincoln was or was not satisfied with Meade, his Army commander. And you read this letter, and my students observed this morning. Lincoln really admonishes Meade. You know, I do not believe you appreciated the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. And later on in the letter, the famous line, he says, "Your golden opportunity is gone, and I'm distressed immeasurably because of it." And I'll tell you the same thing I said to my students this morning. One thing that really colors Lincoln's view of Meade and Gettysburg and the war in Pennsylvania is the war in Mississippi. And the same time that the Union Army is fighting in Adams County, Grant and the Federal Army are taking Vicksburg. And the surrender of the Confederate forces at Vicksburg, over 20,000 men, is a huge victory for the Federal war effort. And Lincoln hears about it. And he thinks that Meade should be able to do to Lee what Grant did to John Pemberton at Vicksburg. So it's very much coloring Lincoln's views. But let me leave you with this, and then we can jump over to the questions. The pursuit from Gettysburg absolutely shapes Meade's reputation, and it's, in my opinion, one of the most important elements of the Gettysburg Campaign for a lot of reasons. And you can read the soldier letters Some thought maybe they should have attacked along the Potomac. You know, we've just beaten the Confederates at Gettysburg. Let's give them that fatal blow. Some, like this soldier, were relieved that they did not attack because the Confederates had dug in, and those trenches were very, very elaborate. This is a soldier in the 97th New York, Willard Judd, and he says, I expect the papers are going to condemn Meade in the strongest terms for allowing Lee to escape. It is really amusing to see the views that most of the leading journalists advance. They all seem to think after General Lee retreated from Gettysburg that it was mere play spell to entirely annihilate the rebel army. He was completely bagged in their estimation, and all that was necessary was to shoulder the bag and carry it off. But when we came to shoulder it, the contents dropped out. Now, of course, the war moves on. Lee's across the Potomac River into Northern Virginia, and soon too will the Army of the Potomac be across the Potomac River, and the war will move on into another phase in the late summer and fall and ultimately winter of 1863. I'm going to pull out of my PowerPoint, y'all. I'm going to hop over on the chat with you and see what questions we have about Meade and Gettysburg.
Okay, Abigail, you want to put the pictures back on? Okay.
Oh, but everyone can, if they want to, they can do it themselves.
Okay, well, I'm going to read the questions first. Let me just ask a question I didn't expect to, but you said you're teaching a class on Gettysburg. What's on the reading list for Gettysburg?
So
For your students?
the class is a Civil War class. It just happened to be Gettysburg Day today. So today was the Gettysburg topic.
If you had a book to recommend though on Gettysburg, what would it be for your class?
Oh my. I don't know that I would assign them a single monograph on Gettysburg. I'd probably do primary source accounts or soldier accounts.
Okay, I don't like doing what I just did, but you mentioned that you were teaching.
Yeah.
That's the only reason I'm doing it. I dislike.
Okay.
I won't allow somebody to say, "Did you really read the Jones book where he paid that 472?" That's not allowed, and I'll stop that from being asked. Let me go on to the other things now. Oh, I mentioned this. I was the one who somebody said there's a Sickles Civil War Roundtable, so I asked about a book they recommended, and I have that book, Sickles the Incredible. Okay, from let's see, me took over for that's a Reynolds. We got that. I thought. Oh, here's. I thought it was because Hooker wanted to go to Richmond and threatened to resign if he wasn't given permission.
Yeah, so let me address the question or the comment above, the Eric's comment who jumped in a couple times. That's not true. Meade did not take over for Reynolds on July the 1st. Meade takes command on June 28th. So I hope I've corrected that false bit of information. Fred's comment about Hooker, the issue actually is the troops at Harper's Ferry is what the rub between Hooker and Lincoln is going to be. And Hooker will offer his resignation. Lincoln accepts it. And then when Meade takes command of the Army of the Potomac, he's given complete authority over the federal troops at Harper's Ferry.
Apparently, somebody corrected it as Taneytown, not Tawnytown.
Correct.
Okay.
That's me.
Okay.
And also,
Just wait, Eric,
all right,
please.
but in essence, she said that Meade really did take over the command when Reynolds died. In other words, that's when he really started to shine, when Reynolds was not, he wasn't codependent on him.
All right. Well, Meade wasn't on the field at that time either. Reynolds was. What was the quality of roads leading into Gettysburg?
Quality of roads leading. So the two that are most important for the Army of the Potomac, primarily the Baltimore Pike, because it will move supplies down to Westminster. It's a macadamized road in parts of it, so that will be the vital supply line that will be important for the Army of the Potomac to protect, which is why East Cemetery Hill, for instance, is so important during the battle.
And it says, you said Meade was not overly cautious. It seems to me that he was cautious in the sense of not going off half-cocked. In that perspective, your views, he needed more definite information gained strength. As you see, it is in this context. How much fighting at Chancellorsville, certainly as far as Meade was directly involved, influenced to direct his thinking July 2nd?
Okay, I need to read that. So at Chancellorsville, Meade is the Fifth Corps are not heavily engaged, so I wouldn't say Chancellorsville directly influenced Meade's thinking in any real sense. We could say perhaps that Chancellorsville influences Sickles' thinking. You know, people would suggest that for Sickles, the reason he's so fixed with the peach orchard is because of what happens to him at Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville. So there might be some connections for some of the Union officers, but because Meade's role in the Fifth Corps is kind of minimal, I wouldn't make that connection. I wouldn't draw that line.
Somebody asked, where's the statue of Meade on Old Baldy?
Okay, so that's on Cemetery Ridge. If you're at Cemetery Ridge, just south of Ziegler's Grove, that statue, that's the one I show in my PowerPoint, which is by all accounts a pretty wonderful representation of Meade and Old Baldy.
And then I saw, it says, of course, Old Baldy is at the GAR Museum. Interesting, that question was whether to stay or retreat. Nobody thought to attack.
Yeah, are you talking about, Fred, I'm looking at your comment, maybe on July the 2nd at the Council of War, I think is what you're referring to.
It's
I'm
not my
right.
question. I'm reading from the chart over here. I don't know. Let's see,
Yeah,
GAR. Yeah.
Okay, I was just gonna say the questions regarding the Council of War on July the 2nd center around whether or not they should stay in that position, retire to another one, or I think this is what you're getting at. The factor it's absent is whether or not that the Union Army would take the offensive. I think that's where you're going. And a lot of that then ends up in the second and third question center around supplies. Like if we're going to stay in this position here at Cemetery Ridge, how long are we able to do that? But there's not a really earnest discussion on whether or not the Federals should pivot and attack the Confederates from Cemetery Ridge.
It is that you resented Meade is a true leader, actively engaged in the Gettysburg battle. Why doesn't the fact play out the way it's portrayed? As you mentioned, even Gelso states that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, Meade's reputation is certainly maligned in his own lifetime. Meade hears the same criticisms that we hear today. Meade hears them. Meade would not be surprised if he would get a copy of Gelso's book. He, in no way, he hears these. So much of that has to do with the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, which we talked about in another venue. Dan Sickles is wounded, as I said. He gets to recover in Washington, D.C., and he's visited by the President of the United States, Lincoln. And one of the first-hand accounts that Lincoln has, not pulling the telegraph off the wire, is from Sickles. And there's no question that that shapes the president's perception. And it's some of those Meade critics like Sickles or Doubleday, Butterfield, that really hit the Northern media hard. They write any numbers of newspapers or accounts, the famous Historicus account that comes out in the winter of '64, all very much slant the view to detract from Meade's activism at Gettysburg. And that's something that is a very strong current for 160 some years later. But I will say this, and you know, I might come off to some of you tonight as a Meade apologist or a revisionist, but go look at the primary records. Pick the official records up and read through them. Read through soldiers' letters. Read the firsthand accounts. And if you do, I think it will be very clear that Meade is much more active in the Battle of Gettysburg than historically he's been portrayed or given credit for. But that's a great question, Tom. Thank you for that.
It says, did the Lincoln cabinet and the leadership in D.C. ultimately understand how much the fighting Gettysburg exhausted Meade's command and depleted his ranks as well as his supplies? If they
Yeah.
did, how long did it take for the truth to set in?
Yeah, great question there, John. My sense of that is not at all. Not at all. And one thing that was really striking, I have obviously the chapter on the Battle of Gettysburg, and then the next entire chapter is devoted to the pursuit. And we talk often about Confederate supply issues, but the Army of the Potomac supplies are very precarious. And you can see that in the soldiers' letters very clearly. from shoes to food to horses, all the essentials to be an effective fighting force are very well depleted. And soldiers will write about not having shoes on the pursuit. They will write about not getting consistent amount of food. So the Army of the Potomac just lost over 20,000 men. Lincoln's asking for it to be reconstituted quickly, refit quickly, resupplied quickly, and then set off on a pursuit. And it's Lincoln, sitting in DC looking at the map and saying, well, all that stuff isn't all that difficult. But the reality for the men on the ground, the reality for Meade is incredibly different. And I use that slide about Saratoga to get us to think about a time in American history, and even think in the Civil War, where two armies fight, the side that wins pursues the defeated army and catches up with it, fights it, and defeats it again. So a battle coupled with a pursuit is an incredibly rare feat in the Civil War military history. So it's not uncharacteristic that Meade doesn't achieve that. It's more common that he doesn't achieve that. But we need to read more than just Gettysburg. We need to be better military historians to put that in its proper context.
I must tell you, the point that you just raised, initially when I heard you speak was at a GAR meeting online a few years ago. And this was a total aspect that was unknown to me. I always thought, as a matter of fact, years ago, we did take a tour at Gettysburg, and the ranger said and he could have followed, and the war could have been over. That's the point that I heard at Gettysburg years ago. But when I heard yours, I said, this point has to be heard. And that's why you're doing it. And that's why you're coming back to do it. And I didn't want to, and to everybody, lecture. I knew that the Gettysburg lecture was going to consume a large portion, and this is something we have the flexibility to do. And I wanted Professor Murray to develop that next point of an entire lecture. And I think it's something that should be known, and that's why she's coming back. And I urge you, please, please tell other people about this next lecture in January. Okay. Let me see. Lincoln. I'm scrolling down a little bit. Come on, I can't scroll anymore. Oh, there we go. From Meade's perspective, did the diversion of some troops to New York City influence what happened in that last Council of War?
Oh,
That was the
that's
riot in New York people are talking about.
Yeah, that's a good question too. Simultaneous to the tail end of the Battle of Gettysburg and into the pursuit is the New York City draft riots. And Meade is going to be detaching, I forget the number off the top of my head, but some portion of the Army of the Potomac is going to be detached and sent up to New York City. So his army is being pulled in, a variety of directions. And I always think I think there's danger in saying, and I don't do this in my own writing, that Meade should have. We have 160 years of hindsight. So when we study these issues, particularly these controversial ones, we have to suspend the fact that we know what happened and put yourself in their shoes at that moment with the information that they had. Meade is supposed to protect Washington, D.C. They just won at Gettysburg. We have the New York City, we have city draft riots, all these issues. Maybe if we think of it that way, the decision not to attack at the Potomac River doesn't seem quite so cautious. Maybe it seems more realistic, more pragmatic than cautious. Good question.
Did Lincoln giving his address at Gettysburg some 4 months after battle temper his initial disappointing view of Meade?
That's a good question too. So Lincoln writes that unsent letter that I shared with you, and there are a few Union generals. Oliver Otis Howard is the one that immediately comes to mind, who actually write Lincoln, and they say, Howard specifically, I'm talking about here, says that Meade did everything he could have done to win a battle and acted accordingly appropriate at Gettysburg and beyond. Howard writes the President of the United States. By the time we get to the middle of July, Lincoln's views have softened. The one thing about that unsent letter, July 14th, y'all, is that it is unsent. Lincoln had a habit, whenever he had something really emotional to say, to write it down and put it in his desk drawer. So if you'd walk into the Oval Office or into Lincoln's desk, you would open his desk drawer and you'd see a bunch of these kind of letters. So he's just, he's blowing off his steam. It's certainly how he feels at that time, but he doesn't send it. If you look at his correspondence that he does send later on in the month, he is much more pragmatic and realistic about what the Army had accomplished at Gettysburg. So I think we tend to, and I did it tonight, I'm guilty of this, we tend to focus on that July 14 letter, but if you read more of Lincoln's correspondence, he realizes that George Meade and the Army of the Potomac won a significant victory at Gettysburg. Great question.
Question: do you agree? I don't know if you're familiar. I don't like when people mention names because then all of a sudden, oh, what's the difference? Do you agree with the late Ted Alexander assessment that Meade's pursuit of Lee compared with McClellan's pursuit of Lee as positively aggressive?
So I'll say that about the McClellan's pursuit, and I live now just outside the boundary of the Antietam battlefield. I'll say this from Meade's perspective. Meade thought that McClellan was too cautious, and we maybe talked about that last month. But in George Meade's eyes, McClellan did not do enough after the Battle of Antietam. And for me, I think that's, it becomes kind of ironic that Meade is saying this in the fall of 62 because the exact same charges are leveled against him in the summer of 1863. But there's no doubt that McClellan casts a very long shadow over Meade in the Army of the Potomac.
The next question, that's the next lecture. Don't answer that one. It says, what campaigns was Meade involved after Gettysburg? And it's like the author says, read my book, you'll read about it. That's the next lecture, guys. It's going to be fully answered or answered. Do you have an opinion of Meade's generalship during the Bristow Station campaign, etc.?
Well, if we're going to get into that next week or
Okay.
next
Okay.
time, but maybe
no, that's what he said. That disregard if it's not.
Or I'll make a general comment about that. And maybe this will, if you think I'm a Meade apologist, maybe here's where I can swing the other way on that. In the fall of 1863, Meade really struggles to do anything meaningful with the Army of the Potomac. They were fighting at places like Bristow Station and Rappahannock Station, but the post-Gettysburg months of the calendar year 1863 are really difficult for Meade. He struggles to work well with Halleck. He struggles to put together a coherent strategic objective. And you see the Union Army and Confederate Army kind of dancing around central Virginia. And I look at this period of time, it's an interesting one because it's right before Grant comes east. So it's the time of Meade's career where he truly has autonomy in commanding his army. And you could argue the evidence shows that he really struggles to do so.
Another great presentation. Can't wait for your book on Meade. Didn't the weather also play a factor in pursuing? Well, again, next month. Thank you for excellence and details. Excellent. I told you, that's good stuff. Excellent. Nobody said superb yet. I'm just flipping fun, but that's seriously. I'll get your compliments afterwards. Grant respected Meade enough to have him assigned to command. Okay, that again. Next question. Superb. There we go. Superb. Thank you. Didn't Doubleday? Oh, it didn't Doubleday initially replace Reynolds and Doubleday became a critic.
Yep. Absolutely right. The short answer to that is yes. And by any accounts, maybe you could say that Doubleday performed well on July the 1st. I mean, I think so. And that's one of the reasons that Meade and Doubleday don't get along particularly well. Doubleday is going to be a pretty vocal critic of Meade. He will testify to Congress in the winter of 1864, very critical. Years later, this is after Meade dies, but Doubleday will come out and sort of apologize for some of the criticisms that he threw at Meade. Time has softened some of that animosity. Meade's dead by then, but Doubleday will retract a little bit of his harsh commentary.
I'll digress for 2 seconds. So Meade, Doubleday was in Mendham Township, and the Mendham Township Library is carrying this program. They have the link. And there's a sign, the town of Abner Doubleday.
Yeah.
Sure, that was a thrilling point I just mentioned. Excellent. Eisenhower, I don't know if that Eisenhower had the same drawer. What is that?
As Lincoln did. He
Oh,
had a drawer in the president's desk where, when he was
okay.
pissed off, he would
Okay.
write nasty letters.
Okay. Okay. How did the South view Meade after the Gettysburg?
Well, I can say from the perspective of the Confederate Army, I can answer that. And I can also say that the South did not view Gettysburg as the setback that we might portray it today. That if you would read Southern newspapers or Southern civilian accounts, they don't see Gettysburg as the place where the war was lost. And Gary Gallagher writes about that in Confederate War, that the morale is still quite high, even after the setback or after the defeat at Gettysburg. They don't see it as a setback.
Yeah.
Now, the soldiers, looking at Confederate soldier accounts after Gettysburg, they kind of want Meade to attack. When they're dug in and around the Potomac River, around Hagerstown and Williamsport, they're very confident that that defensive position that they have will repulse a Union attack. And they're anticipating and hoping that the Union Army attacks because their morale is still high and they're very, very certain that their position is a good defensible one. That's a good question.
Thanks. I can't wait to get the book. Okay, now you're getting a comment from Caleb Rodriguez. Let me tell you, Caleb is a student. We have a special student rate of $10 to students to join our roundtable. He's homeschooled. He's been watching our programs, and we're sort of proud that we have a number of students that actually have joined our roundtable and as members.
Mhm.
And then also for History Day, they become a member for the balance of the year. But Caleb is our first student. So this I was going to ask this question. It says Scott McKinley asked. I was going to ask Scott. I was going to ask this question. It says, "Will you be attending the Battlefield Book Fest of Gettysburg because they're going to have a nerds section on Gettysburg?" And I was going to say to Scott, "You'll come in as our ringer." No,
No,
it's going to be they're going to have a book fest. The American Battlefield Trust is having a book fest at Gettysburg. So one of the things they're going to have is a Gettysburg for nerds, and it's going to be a program of questions.
yeah, very nice. Yeah.
No, I thought we'd sponsor you. No, as a ringer, you come in. You have to come anonymously, of course, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, how important? How important was General Hunt's noticing the Confederate buildup of ammunition for Pickett's charge to Meade's success at Gettysburg? If Hunt hadn't noticed this, would the Union have lost the Battle of Fourth Day?
Well, I would say this about the Union Army's position at Gettysburg. And even if the Pickett's charge attack had worked, let's say that the line breaks through, regarding the second part of your question, Meade has the Sixth Corps, the Reserve Corps, completely at his disposal. So I find it hard to believe that, or hard to imagine a scenario where the Confederate assault breaks through and it works, and that Meade is not able to somehow stabilize his line, drawing a lot on the Sixth Corps, his Reserve Corps.
What do you think of Beauregard's comment
no, but
that
please,
no
Eric,
amount of
please,
men can
Eric,
take that
Eric,
field?
Eric, this is rude.
How about I just sort of finish up then and say I can put my email in the chat, and I appreciate everybody's comments and participation tonight. Hopefully you learned a little bit something useful about General Meade. And Rich, thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure to chat with you about Meade and Gettysburg this evening.
There's one more thing here. It says on July 4th, actually, it's a whole program on charge of the casualties. Actually, believe it or not, I do a lecture on Cornelia Hancock at Gettysburg. Harry, if you're watching this, Raritan Men's Club, I do that lecture.
Okay.
One of the great nurses who is out there. Guys, I want to thank you all for attending. Dr. Murray, really, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rich. I appreciate
I'm
it.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward
Thank
to
you,
January.
Professor.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
Very good. Terrific.
Thank you. That was excellent. Much appreciated.
Oh, by the way, before you hang up, if anybody wants to be on the list, it's NJ Civil War RT at AOL.com, and then will receive a notice of the Civil War legal presentation that's going to be on the third week of November. So I'll say goodnight.
But by the way, there's going to be a book on Cornelia Hancock coming out from Carolyn Ivanhoff.
Great. Okay. Good night, guys.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye-bye.